Hey, what's going on YouTube? Today I'm going to be talking about why Meteor and the Sorcerer class in general feels a little bit worse than just Rune Master as a whole, and why Meteor can't really push competitively corruption compared to other classes. And I'm going to kind of explain as to why Meteor in particular, but Sorcerer in general is just not getting there compared to other classes. And I think most of it comes down to resource management. So the cool thing about Meteor and the interesting thing about Meteor is that the skill is a 900% increase damage effectiveness skill with a huge flat damage bonus, right? So the whole aspect of the skill and the whole gimmick of the skill is that sure, it costs a lot, but it hits hard, right? The issue is it's really hard to scale damage on a skill when you're so caught up trying to manage its resources. As a skill that costs so much, it requires so much, you have to either use a secondary supporting skill, which then you're cutting your resources down in focus of Meteor to focus on a secondary attack skill or a cantrip, if you will, something you're going to be casting more regularly, and then you're using Meteor as kind of a finisher or side skill or something you use whenever your mana's looking good. The problem is Meteor is never going to be one of those skills that you can just constantly cast unless you're using, like, specifically cast on crit or some kind of, really high resource management mana regen character. Which, don't get me wrong, you can definitely hard cast Meteor over and over and over again. There's no way to say you can't. You can, but the problem with that is you won't be able to scale the damage because you're so busy trying to scale your mana regen, because we have no way of actually changing our flat mana regen, and mana regen increases seem to have a pretty hard diminishing return. So there's a point where mana regen starts to kind of feel like you're over committing to it, where you're, using a prefix on every single piece of your gear to focus on mana or mana regen, and therefore you're sacrificing one of those prefixes that could be used towards targeting damage. And then if you are using Meteor as a support skill, then you're typically going to be focusing more towards scaling your fireball skill, making Meteor just kind of a glorified 10k damage attack, which is like, cool, 10k damage is a lot, don't get me wrong, but if you're fighting a boss, it's, in the grand scheme of things, is it really going to do much to hit 10k damage on a 400 corruption area boss, Like, I don't think the Reign of Dragons boss is going to care much about one meteor every 3 minutes during its boss fight. So you compare Meteor to something like blast rain traps or some detonating arrow traps, or just like something that can shotgun, and you notice that 10k damage of Meteor, even if you can make it trigger like 15 times per second, we'll say, there are builds out there that are able to deal 4 to 5k damage 30 times per second, which are like doing a lot more damage and spending a lot less mana to do so. And also, they don't have to wait for things like delayed effects of Meteor, because Meteor does have a really long cast animation. So you do need a lot of cast speed to make it feel good, or you need to use something like Harbinger of the Stars plus attack speed on Mana Strike to make it feel good. And then the fall speed feels delayed. There's a lot of inconsistencies in the skill if you're using cast on crit, and also the problem with cast on crit in general is that it's a slow build and you're not really getting much for being a melee meteor mage. Like, I don't know, the idea of having to stand there and just wail on an enemy and until meteors start falling, and then if you're fighting a boss, it's like you could pelt it with 50 meteors, man, and that boss is still standing. And it doesn't matter because corruption plus meteor doesn't scale damage good enough, because it doesn't shotgun or it doesn't have good overlapping. It just doesn't make for a good skill. I don't know. This is coming from someone, by the way, who has been playing Meteor and cast on crit Meteor, but mainly just like Meteor, period, for a very long time. And was like my main skill, and Sork was my main ordeal. And then Rune Master came out eventually. And when Rune Master came out, I realized Sorcerer really doesn't do much compared to what Spellblade or Rune Master can do. Sorcerer is a little too gimmicky, and I think the only reason you're ever playing Sorcerer nowadays is to cast Meteor in compared to Rune Master, because Rune Master gets access to things like Runic Invocation, which is just a fantastic passive and active skill, and also has access to some of the best mage passive skills available. It's able to use some of these glyphs and runes to really push its damage potential, and can scale things like elemental penetration, which is something that Sorcerer doesn't really have access to in a large margin. That is, even with Meteor having Craterborn for a 75% elemental pen, it's not doing enough. Meteor dealing 10k damage, or maybe even capping at 14 or 15k damage per meteor, is just not enough. When you compare that to 3 or 4 5k attacks or blasts happening all at once, right? If you just have multiple projectiles or just multiple things exploding all at once, it's dealing the same amount of damage in the same amount of time for less mana. It's not costing you, 120 mana to do that. It's like, okay, I can cast a meteor 4 times before I run out of mana and have to use focus and stand still for a while, and then that slows down your echo progression and how fast you can clear an area. But also it affects the playstyle and the comfortability of the skill. It doesn't feel like I can just regularly cast Meteor and keep walking, cast Meteor and keep walking. I feel like I'm constantly having to cast Meteor and then mess with my resources to make sure that I can cast my next Meteor, and then the enemies are coming at me while I'm regenning mana, so I have to use my Fireball now, and Fireball feels so crappy, and you know all these other things, this, that, and the other. Yeah, it just doesn't make sense. This is mainly just a rant about Meteor and how it needs fixing, or Sorcerer in general just needs a fix of some kind, because it is just a little bit too underpowered at the moment. Meteor by itself ain't cutting it, I don't think. Anyways, I will leave a link in the description of the cast and crit Meteor build that's playing in the background here. So if you do want to check out the build, you can. But I do warn you, cast and crit Meteor is a slow build. It doesn't feel that good, and it looks better than it feels. I'll tell you that much. Don't fall for it. But at the same time, if it is something you really want to do, absolutely do it. The game is, at the end of the day, for fun and not competitive, unless you're trying to be competitive. If you're trying to be competitive, I honestly say stay away from mage in general, unless you're playing Rune Master. But I would say have fun with the game. Experiment. It doesn't hurt to try everything. So if Meteor is something you haven't tried at least once before, I definitely say go give it a try. But at the end of the day, just don't get your expectations up and your hopes up for the skill, because it's not great in its current form, and hopefully it gets adjusted. But we shall see how it goes. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time.